Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Phoenix Wisdom Podcast. My name is Janet Sandberg, and I am your host. I am also a intuitive healer, coach, mentor, and of course, suicide prevention and awareness advocate. And we are here sharing stories about lived experiences. And today I am joined by Justin McSweeny. Justin, welcome.
Thank you, Janet. I appreciate it. And hello to the audience as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'll do my biography as it relates to sort of present current events. And, like you, I have a show, an interview series that I do, and that's one of my favorite hobbies. I have many hobbies, but that's probably the one in the last 4 years, 3.5, 4 years, that has captured my heart and my attention. And my show brushes broad strokes. It talks to people both in academia and everyday folks. And the show tends to revolve around things related to sense, meaning, and purpose. And I can open that up later in the conversation. But I talk to people. I like to lean into cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and psychology to understand our species a little better from a psycho-emotional, psychosocial perspective. So, but like I said, I love people with survival stories, people that had terrible things happen to them in their lives and they came out of it well, which has overlap with what you do. And I
Yeah.
love the arts and aesthetics. I've had artists and musicians and actors and directors and nothing Hollywood, blockbuster type stuff, but people who really craft wonderful experiences and narratives and media products, art. So that's what I do as a hobby. Also, I love botany and horticulture, so my plants and I get along wonderfully. I take care of them and they bring me such joy to my life. Living in Florida, I have afforded year-round green.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yes,
it's a
that
wonderful.
I'm sure is helpful.
My plants and I, we get along good. So.
Yeah. When I used to live on the West Coast and
Mm.
yeah, the gardening is so much better out there.
Yeah, yeah. I swear if I lived up north where we had winter seasons again, I'd have the biggest greenhouse. I'd have a solarium that I could live in. And I'd have all my little fruit trees and palms and I'd bring it with me. So, but I don't see myself migrating anytime soon. Although I did grow up in the mid-Atlantic, DC,
Okay.
Virginia area.
Okay,
So
yeah.
I am no stranger to the cold, but I do not
Yes.
miss it.
Well, thank you for sharing all of that. Your podcast sounds amazing. I'll have to give it a listen. What's it called?
It's called the IdeaCast interview series, and I'm happy to shamelessly plug it because I derive no revenue from it. It's
Absolutely.
you could call it a public service, and I've had some absolutely amazing people on there, people that just floor me. They're my heroes, intellectual heroes, and so it's a treat. It's really that's why I say it's my
Mhm.
favorite little pet hobby because these people actually say yes when I reach out to them. I'm like, yay, I get to talk to them
Yes.
and really unpack some interesting ideas and concepts. So
Cool.
yeah.
Cool. Well, let's unpack your story
Yeah.
today because you're here on my podcast right now.
All right.
So
All right.
tell us your story. Let's start at the beginning. When you were feeling suicidal, what was
Yeah.
happening? Why were you
Yeah.
feeling that way?
A colorful story. So, grew up in a sort of typical middle class suburban neighborhood in Washington, D.C., born to parents who probably shouldn't have been parents, but they did the best they could. So, there's absolutely no judgment. But the conditions of childhood experience and their marriage were terrible to be to the point. They just it was very dysfunctional. Both of them were generational trauma
Mm.
children, adults, and they just had a real rough time. So my father was actually a battered spouse, and the it's I could call it violence in 2024. In the 70s, it was just people fighting and things like that.
Right.
So that was my childhood exposure was a lot of deep dysfunction, a lot of anger and physical violence and things like that. And I got to, had a front row to that. And I think as a child, I was definitely, and I still am, an empath by nature. So I wick all those kind of things up. And so fast forward into teenage years, and about 15 or 16, I entered into a rather persistent depressive state. And not so much for, I would say, environmental conditions were normal friends, normal environment. But I think as I mentioned just now about the early childhood years, I think there was some catch up going on there in
Mhm.
my psychic profile. And I just was profoundly lonely and was very nihilistic and really not even so much a question of, why am I here? It's just I didn't want to be here. I just had no interest in being, period. I mean, it was not overt to where I was, pulling pins on hand grenades every 10 minutes and, trying to snuff myself, but I was very nihilistic, very self-destructive, and I cared not for my survival. I would do terribly dangerous things as a teenager, including I had some really tough friends who I thought they were tough, and I would pull stunts and they would freak out and they would get really upset because I'd like hit the headlights on my car and just drive into to walk one-way street and
Oh my
full speed
gosh.
ahead. And I didn't care if I hit something, that's great, whatever. But I had people in the car with me, which is horrible. I look on it in hindsight. There's nothing to brag about or be proud of at all. But I would do stupid things like that. So to the moments of my first bout with really wanting to concretize the thoughts is a few weeks after graduating from high school. Had gotten myself properly inebriated, and I started I should back up for a second. I started self-medicating around 12 with alcohol, and started smoking dope around. I grew dope before I smoked it. Again, I love plants, but I started growing weed at 13 and started smoking it around that time
Wow.
too. So very much self-medicating.
The
Try and
horticulture started early.
Yeah, I credit that. My love for cannabis, back this was in the late 70s, early 80s. Well, 82, I guess, was when I started that kind of stuff. But yeah, I just loved, and it was in a agrarian environment too. My mother moved me out of the city, hoping to get me into a more bucolic environment, a more country-fied environment, but the town that she moved us into, everybody grew dope. So I just started growing dope, like with everybody else. But I was 13.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that kind of helps to background the story of, at 18, just out of high school and probably had a few beers, smoked a little dope or whatever. And you said I could get a little bit graphic here. What I did is I had a break barrel 12 gauge shotgun and I loaded a shell and cocked the hammer back, stuffed the barrel in my mouth and started slamming the buttstock on the ground. Not so much that I wanted to commit suicide, but I just wanted to see what the odds were, if something might happen, So,
A little
and,
Russian roulette.
yeah, and I was living with my mother just after getting out of high school, and in retrospect, I probably wanted to spite her because we had a terrible, terrible relationship. It was very adversarial and no compassion, no familial love. What is the Philostorgia is the love of a parent to a child. Philostorgia. Yeah, there was none of that. I probably in some Freudian domain, I wanted to just paint the walls with my head and say, "Here you go, mom. Thanks for getting me this far." Yeah. So anyway, not to upset or trigger anybody in the audience, but yeah, that was the first round, and it kind of shocked me a little bit that I did that, but not really. It just kind of came and went, and even at 55, in retrospect, I don't regret it. Obviously, I lived through it, or I wouldn't be here talking to you. And I certainly wouldn't advocate for that type of behavior. But it was a point in my life is a vector point in my life that I can look back on and say, that was a low. That was
That was
really
definitely a low. Yeah.
yeah, and at a time when most people are getting out of high school and they're like, yay, But on top of just being lonely and nihilistic, I also felt terrible because I was fairly bright, but I didn't go to college. I went into culinary. I was a cook and learning the culinary arts. I was working in an escoffier restaurant. I was doing all the right things as far as wanting to be a chef. And I ended up becoming a chef. I ended up owning a restaurant when I got older, but that was part of the burden of guilt. But it was also in probably a circular pattern of thinking with regard to, I don't want to be here. I don't like me. I don't like life. I don't like, I had friends, so it's just
Yeah.
this whole thing. And people who deal with depression, you understand this, where I'm coming from. So fast forward a little bit more, I think I snapped out of the depressive aspect of my life at about 21 to 22, started enjoying life, and having fun. And part of that was again through self-medication. I just have this long storied history, nothing traumatic. I was never, I would say I was probably a borderline alcoholic because I drank quite a bit when I was younger, but a lot of young guys
Yeah.
do drink a lot.
Yeah.
So I don't know where the lines are there. At 21, though, ironically, when I was old enough to drink, I actually started pulling back and abstaining, and I was very much sober at 21. I kind of had enough,
Well,
and
yeah, you've been drinking already for half your
for
life
six
at
or
that
7
point.
years.
So,
Yeah, so I pulled back. I do things differently than other folks, I guess. So, but then I would reestablish the relationship, but it was never to excess after that. It was just those early years that there were no limits. Especially in high school,
yeah.
machismo and bravado, like, oh, I can drink a case of beer, that's no problem, or half a gallon of liquor. But yeah, the depression started to ebb off at around 21 to 23, and then again, I was thinking about all this when I knew I was going to come on and talk to you. What I think happened was anger and aggression sort of neither filled the void or came to prominence as the depression sort of ebbed off. And so there was this lingering anger and aggressive tendencies that came out of again, probably what was, passing down trauma to the child from two
Mhm.
parents that were, again, deeply dysfunctional. And that carried through my life. I'll fast forward till about late 30s. I owned a restaurant at the time and became very bitter. The restaurant did fine, but I was just a very bitter person. And my wife and I owned a newsstand and a restaurant, and but there was just this underlying lack of fulfillment or satisfaction with what I was doing. And just to survive in the restaurant business, we ran 4 years and then we sold it, and then kept the newsstand that we had, and then I opened up a landscaping business because I'd had one prior to the restaurant. I call myself chronically self-employed. Anyway, I'm building up to a point here. So there was this underlying kind of resentment for all the effort I put into the food and beverage into the restaurant we owned. And it did okay, but it wasn't a storied success. It was not my measure of success. And I just kind of had a chip on my shoulder about that, but not a big one. It was just kind of a subtle one. But again, retrospect, I can see it. And that kind of anger and aggression, I of course internalized, because people who are subject to abuse or subject to childhood adversity will internalize a lot of things, and then it will express itself in self-destructive ways. And so the drug use started to come back a little bit because I had friends that were pretty hardcore drug users, and so I dabbled with them, and it was harder drugs like OxyContin and things like that. But I never did it a lot. I've seen how that stuff has destroyed people's lives. So I would do it like one day a week, but I still drank a little bit. So there was a little bit of that in the background. And in 2011, I sold the restaurant in 2006, and I had started my landscape business. I was running that. 2011, I had a chemical brain injury. There was something on, not from the drugs or alcohol, but from
Okay.
a contaminant in our house.
Oh
And
my gosh.
yeah, and so I had this strong degradation, neurophysiological degradation, to the point where I had Parkinsonism, no speech fluency, no memory at all. I could not process. I could remember my past in a biographical sense, but I could not form memory. I was not encasing
Making
memories in,
memories.
yeah, right. New memory, short-term memory was shot. You and I could be talking and I wouldn't know what you were saying. The words would be there. I'd understand the words, but they wouldn't gel. They would stick
Right.
with me. So I was in this quasi-vegetative state, and
Wow.
physical, not quite paralysis, but my gait, I had, I think I call it ataxia, like your cerebellar ataxia, where my gait was very staggered, like drunk. I couldn't walk very well. A lot of joint pain, just a lot of weird somatic response. And so I went to a neurologist, and they found out I had Hashimoto's. So thank goodness I went there. My little thyroid was deficient. So they put me on, my general practitioner put me on some thyroid medicine, which helped with that. Nothing, they couldn't find anything wrong
Hmm.
through MRIs or any of these other things. And so that persisted for several years. And in the
Oh my
first,
gosh.
yeah, in the upswing from late 2011 into 2012, I was so degraded physically and cognitively that the idea of suicide came back, but not for the reasons. This is interesting. There are multiple aspects or perspectives, I guess one could lens ideation and consideration through. And this was a second perspective for me. It was not born of depression. It was not born of unworthiness or esteem or any of these other things. It was that my mind and body had basically gotten shot. And I thought I would have these terrifying experiences in this state that I was in, where I felt like everything was slipping and I was going to become an invalid, a mental invalid. It's like almost
Mhm.
like your sanity was leaving you, or your
Right.
attachment to reality was. I would come in waves, and it was 4 or 5 times a week where there's just onset, and it felt like I was just being ripped out of my cognitive capacity to process reality. It was a scary, nasty
Yeah.
thing. And it was, yeah, because it would just come on, and I the only thing that kept me from freaking out is that it had happened before, and I came back. And so I was like,
Right.
okay, well, maybe I'll come back from this one, and I won't turn into a, comatose vegetative person. And that persisted for quite a while. And those were the times where I thought, if I get any worse, I'm gone. I am going to go get that, whatever it is, some kind of drug to just take myself out, because I'm not going to live like this. So it was more of a quality of life thing, and
Yeah.
not wanting to be a burden, especially to my wife, who,
Hmm.
didn't ask for this kind of commitment. So, or I didn't want to end up in a ICU or a vegetative state, on a
Yes.
respirator. I did not want
Yeah.
that. So that's kind of a softer version of the ideation, but it was there. I was like, yeah, I can do it. I can just take myself out and that'll be fine. So that gave me an interesting perspective. And now to build a pleasant story on top of all of this, this is kind of where a journey began for me to not only recover myself and to rehabilitate myself, but also ask some larger questions of life, of our species, of that which we do, and maybe some of the whys of why we're doing what we're doing and what is life, and yeah, some of the deeper questions that you might get pressed to consider when something like this occurs. And over the course of about 4 or 5 years, I was able to recover most of my cognitive capacity. There's still a light film over my sort of conscious perception of the world.
Mm.
I liken it to sometimes if you take a cold medicine and you get that kind of fuzzy head
Yeah.
or brain foggy. It's like that, but it's backgrounded. I've either gotten used to it or it does not diminish my capacity to do anything anymore, and which is great. I'm absolutely
Yeah.
ecstatic about that. So I'll stop there, and then I can build a bridge to a better, cheerful story. But I wanted to, I'll check in with you and see if you wanted to handle any of things that I.
Yeah, no, I'm fully
You're
into your
good.
story. I'm like, I want to know how you
Okay.
got from there to here.
Yeah. Well, it was a long journey, and I mentioned my love for plants. And so for about 20 something years, I built up a collection of botanical specimens in my yard. I had 115 species of palms in my yard. I had
Oh,
like a
wow.
dozen rare fruit things going on, mangoes, avocados, and all exotic things, 6 different types of bananas. So what I would do for part of my rehab, since conventional medicine was like, yeah, so they couldn't really pinpoint anything. Okay, okay. So I went out and I would rehab myself through my plants, and I would go up, and prior to this attack in 2011, the Latin binomials, the science names of the plants, I had them all. I had 300 names in my head for the stuff that was in. So I would go up to a plant and I would say, okay, what is this? What? And so Arcana Phoenix Tuckerii. Okay, yeah, okay, I got that one, and then I would just try to, and I would go out almost every day and just that was my rehab. I'd go up and I'd walk up to a plant. Sometimes I'd just blank. There was nothing. But then, I just build it up and now I could go back out. So it took a while, but that was one of my tools, my little hacks for
Yeah.
trying to reboot or jumpstart the old noggin to get it to do things. And so with that, I also found an interest in philosophy and overlapped with spirituality.
Mhm.
And because I've always been sort of spiritually curious, never a religious person, my mother tried to put me in a religious environment and I rejected it vehemently. And it's nothing, there's no disrespect meant towards any of the belief systems. It's just that none of that really resonated with me. But I was still innately curious about things beyond the tactile and the apparent. And so my journey of recovery included the inquiry into some of these deep questions, some of these ideas that most of us ponder one time or another, especially about mortality. I'm not as interested in mortality or what's going on after mortality. That doesn't really do much for me, but it's what's going on in our evolutionary story, our story of relating to one another, our relating to the environment that we occupy. And so I found some incredible philosophers that were asking these kind of questions, but they were obviously, light years ahead of me in terms of academic qualifications and chops and all that. So that was another amazing rehabilitation tool, was to force myself to understand as much as I could the really difficult and abstruse language of these philosophers.
A
And
challenge for us and at the
it,
best of times.
it is, but it is such a turn on for me because I was diagnosed as dyslexic as a child, and I think there's overlap with ADHD, and I'm
Yeah.
very much hyperactive, excessively hyperactive. I'm 55 and I'm still like 26 years old running around like a little Jack Russell Terrier or something. So it helps to have that kind of obsessive nature and stores of energy to do that. But the one thing that's helped me regain my confidence in a raison d'etre, as the French would say, is a reason to be, or a reason for uh, being invested in the next turn of the page or the next frame of existence is wanting to be a helpful person and wanting to be a contributing person to
Mhm.
the story of our species, the story of us. And you'll hear me say species a lot, not only because I like botany and things, and so I look at things as species, but it unites us. We cannot divide ourselves when we consider ourselves to be a monotypic species, one human species, because that, to me, it just sort of reifies a unity that can't be shaken. We can't break that thing up too much unless we choose to, and then we have to figure out why we're choosing to do that. So yeah, so that's part of the show that I have is I bring people in who do philosophy and they speak to these ideas, existential ideas, or somewhere in that nexus of spirituality. And so my moves that I make with regard to spirituality is I remove things. I take things away in order to occupy a space that is not quite a vacuum, but it is a space of potential, and it is a space of not knowing and being comfortable with not knowing.
Mhm.
And maybe Buddhism speaks to this a little bit, but that for me has been good medicine in terms of not being terribly angsty about my existence or what is meaning, what is purpose, what is sense making. It's helped me very much to be at peace with not knowing and not needing to know. And that sounds weird for somebody
Yeah.
because you think about philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, is to know, is to learn. But I turn it around and I just say it's an unending series of inquiries. It is nothing but inquiries. Whatever epistemic value or knowledge value comes from it, for me, the move I make is just to hold it and not try to claim it, not try to grasp it too tightly or to anchor myself to it, to a
Right.
belief. And because when I'm cynical, I think that beliefs can be that which is part of our undoing, part of our shadowy aspect of our nature is when we get
Mhm.
too strong in our beliefs and too anchored in a belief that
Yes.
it creates this myopic aperture closing or perspectival narrowing. And so that, and again, I'm not trying to be prescriptive for the audience, but just, the idea of opening the aperture and opening up a willingness to hold information, but not become the story of that information or become embedded with that information, that it can flow freely through you. And you don't necessarily have to advocate for it or speak to it in its defense, if that makes sense. So I'll
Yeah.
stop there
I mean,
because now I'm going to start going
it
into some
does to
weird.
me, but yeah, it's that the art of surrender, the art of letting go. And a lot of, what brings on depression is that we're so focused on what this isn't the life I want to have. This isn't
Mm-hmm,
how I want to feel.
mm-hmm,
And we just get so stuck in this isn't what I want instead of A, focusing on, well, what do we want? How do I want to feel? We actually have that control,
right.
right, over how we want to feel. But I lost my train of thought completely,
Well, it's that,
letting go and just, yeah,
yeah.
letting not being so focused on what's going to happen
Mm-hmm,
and just
mm-hmm,
letting what happens happen. We do have to guide and steer a little bit,
mm-hmm.
but the outcome will happen whether we're holding on for dear life or not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I alter the frame just a little bit here. And so the audience came here to maybe get inspired, or maybe I could dispense a couple of thoughts, not mine, but be the conduit again of these ideas that some of these, pretty heavy thinkers have come up with. And it touches, we'll begin with what you were just saying, in that some of the people I've interviewed are cognitive scientists. And one of the things they speak to is that we, in the process of cognition, are using something called predictive processing. There's a guy that goes so far as to call it active inference, Carl Friston. He's kind of a flavor of the minute guy. He's a long storied career, but he's coming to prominence now. And so active inference is the brain's way of minimizing error in prediction and for the next frame of a reality to unfold, that when it makes that prediction, it wants to keep lower states of entropy or lower states of surprise. And entropy is a big crazy word for the expenditure of your energy, your either cognitive or physical energy, to make that prediction, to make your move. Now, that's a kind of a heady, lofty idea, but when you think about it as a human being who is sense making
Mhm.
in reality, frame by frame, and sense making can be as simple as your sensory motor loop, all of your organs of perception, eyes, ears, nose, throat, skin, all those things that are giving you all that data and information. And then your brain is calculating, making predictions about what's going to happen next. What I would offer to the audience when we are predictive processing is those of us that have had trauma, those of us that occupy depression or anxiety or other states that are negative affect or negative valence, as the psychologist would say, is that is a predictive processing loop going on there, and that it can become circular in a sense, and the reciprocal
Absolutely.
opening or narrowing may favor narrowing because your predictions of what's going to happen next can be built upon your histories, all the layers of your histories of those other previous interactions with reality. So I just say that as a little carrot to hang out there to say, go study things about predictive processing, because one way to work yourself out, I believe, of a jam, whether it's a psycho-emotional jam or it's a spiritual jam, is to go be curious and go listen to some of these guys talk. And there's stepping down of power. There's the really crazy stuff where it's just obnoxious. And then there are people who try to dilute that out a little bit so that it's more palatable and more digestible for us, common general audience, not
Right.
5 PhDs, and professorships and all that kind of stuff. And so I would encourage you to think about the model of predictive processing as one means of just kind of figuring out who you are and what this system does, the system of you does. And
We think this is going to happen based on our own experience, right? That's
right,
what happened before. So that's obviously what's going to happen again.
right.
That's the only thing that we know.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that that's the only thing out there. That's the only
Mhm.
option.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when we can open the aperture further, that alleviates some of the burden of the catastrophizing and the circular loops of worthiness issues or whatever that is to the fore in your processing of thoughts and emotions. Is that, and again, this isn't prescribing a psychological method or practice of curing yourself, but it's getting the brain involved in its own game to help it to make sense of what it's doing or what the cognitive process is doing, and to open these guys who do cognitive science their ideas up a little more. And this is a little, they go back and forth, they love to argue, but there's something called 4E cog sci. So there's embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended cognition. And these are other ways of looking at how we sense make reality. So the embedded cognition it's not just, we often think that the brain is the seat of consciousness, but there really is no locus of consciousness here. It's very
Right.
intuitive because all of our sense organs are up in our head. Our
Hmm.
eyes, nose, mouth, taste, ears, hearing, sense of touch, all of that. So it seems very intuitive that the locus of our consciousness is up here, but the body is doing an incredible amount of processing of information. And I have a guest coming on my show. I'm recording the conversation tomorrow. His name's Tom Gilbert. He's heading up this school of something called hologenomics, and they want to bring the enteric system in and all the microbiome, which have a whole bunch of different
Yep.
neurochemicals that
Yep.
that work with the brain. There's
Yep.
also macrophages, which are kind of viruses that can do RNA transgenic influence. So there's so many things going on that we just sort of, we don't foreground it. It's just sort of this background process that's going on. So that's the embedded cognition, including our microbiome, which can have an influence. The gut flora can have an influence on our emotional states and so forth. The enacted cognition is how we interact with the world. The physical motricity, as they would say, the physical moving through the world and moving
Hmm.
through space is the enacted cognition. And that's very important. It's what we do to be mobile and to make ourselves tactile human beings where we're manipulating things in the world. The extended cognition is really fascinating because we're really at that junction right now as modern humans with artificial intelligence, machine learning, the internet, all the mediums of information, television, radio, the internet, that's all extended cognition. It could be as simple as a notepad and you write something down so you don't forget it. That's extended theoretical, abstracted theoretical cognition. It's not part of your brain process or your mentation, but nonetheless, it is that which enables you to go beyond just the brain box and the
Yep.
memories
Yep.
stored in there. So what do we do? We embodied, enacted, and extended, and then what was the other one that I was thinking of? Gosh, I forgot my other E. But anyway, these are all little things. These are all little tools that we can use to
Yeah.
help us understand. There's P's on top of E's. There's procedural, perspectival, participatory, and propositional knowing. And these are really important too, if I could just keep pontificating about what these guys talk about, because we live in a world that is very much a propositional way of knowing. It's all very hard binary. Either something is true or it's false, or,
Yeah.
yes or no, or on or off, and we're like our computers, it's all about raw intelligence. And perspectival knowing is kind of what you and I are doing. We're sharing perspectives, we're sharing ideas. I'm, taking your perspective and enmeshing it with mine and learning from it, and we build something from that. Participatory knowing is the same thing. We're engaged, we're participating with each other to build a better construct of an idea or a thought or feelings or whatever. And then the procedural knowing is important too, because there are steps to doing things as creatures with our cognitive capacity. We have procedural knowing. That's how we do science. That's how we do mathematics, education, all these kind of things. So these are all, I bring all of this nonsense to the fore because it is a way, I think, that if you're struggling with an existential crisis or a crisis of worth and meaning and purpose, that when you really see the incredible nature of this system that is you, this person that is you, it's just mind-blowing. It's
Yeah.
absolutely incredible. And one of my weird pet things that I like to think about is the continuum of going from a planet that was a hot blob of molten steel and a few other nickel and a few other things 4.5 billion, 5 billion years ago, coalescing into something that had that Goldilocks thing going for it, that life comes in. You could call it, they call it autopoiesis, this abiogenesis of life, or if you're into creation myths or stories, however you want life to come onto Earth, but that life came here or arrived or emerged or whatever.
Happened.
It happened, and suddenly you and I are on a silicon thing with electrons, and we're manipulating these things here that are exaptive. These were not, our mouths didn't develop for communication. They developed to eat. The tongue developed to taste for quality of food, whether we're poisoning ourselves or not, or eating good food. So all these amazing things have lined up and coalesced into where we find ourselves now. So when you can almost kind of distract yourself into this wonder, this awe of what this system is, this human system, and all the other living systems, to never diminish their value, and they're part of that story of the growth from kind of nothingness to where we find ourselves. You can
Well, I
get
think
lost.
that's part of the trouble is that we get so bogged down in our
Mm,
own lives and our own stories and the
mm,
right now and how much this sucks that we don't think about the miracle of being that we are
mhm,
and the life and looking at it from
mm,
that, eagle's eye perspective
mhm,
and seeing
mhm,
that we are a part of something so much bigger and there's so much more possibility and curiosity. Just,
mhm.
what else could
Yeah.
happen? What else could I experience? And we just have to get out of that cage that we get stuck in, thinking like, this is it. This human body that I have is just,
Mhm.
a lump of meat and I have
Yeah.
these thoughts and that's it. And you get up, you go to work, you eat, you sleep, and that's it. But yeah, like you were saying, we are so much more than that and so much
Mhm,
more complex. And we don't even understand all of these things, even all of the E's and P's that you were
mhm.
explaining. We don't
It's the
even,
best we can do.
that's
It's the best we've
just,
got. Yeah.
touching the surface.
Yeah, yeah. It does give you pause to wonder, and I mean wonder in a good way. Just so it's not meant to be a salve or any kind of silver, bullet to try to pull yourself out of an existential quagmire. But what I might add, if you don't mind my going on another tangent, what I might add to that is in modern Western culture, we find ourselves again in that propositional, my one guy that I follow calls it propositional tyranny, wherein we are so married to, or we've so much reified this idea of this hard binary thinking without the flexibility of putting things on continuums, of putting things on scales or spectrums, and allowing for oscillation back and forth. There is a impoverishment of that way of thinking in our Western culture. There's also a strong sense of individualism in our Western culture
Mhm.
because we are a hard market system, and we commodify ourselves, we commodify just about everything. And I'm not critiquing it. I'm certainly not going down any kind of Marxist rabbit holes, but it's a reality that we are a strong individualistic culture, and there are trade-offs to that. There are cost benefit to that, and one of the benefits might be that if you want to be an individualist, for me, it's all about just being a good human and keeping your emotional hygiene as well as you can, and your psychic hygiene as well as you can, so that you are prosocial, empathetic, caring, contributing. That to me is individualism. It's not, this is my land and, all that kind of stuff. It's more about, if you want to make that move, you have to reciprocate. You have to immediately unfold yourself back into a community as an individual who has their stuff together, who can be a contributing member of a community. So like for me, individualism is silly. It's necessary only for that which you keep yourself glued together and present as a good person.
Yeah.
For lack of any other judgments, it's you present as a good person authentically. You show up as a good person. And what I might prescribe is that if you're struggling in a kind of nihilistic vacuum or an existential mire, again, is that community is so important.
Mm.
And that's another thing that we've lost, is having authentic, empathic, loving, caring, compassionate community that can firewall the possibility or propensity for becoming an in-group that then looks at other groups and says, well, we're enlightened, and just you have to work that into your scheme to have a community that is not concerned about what others are doing, but that you're caring for yourselves, like an extended family, but not a dysfunctional extended family.
Right.
This is very difficult stuff to begin with, but once you tap into it, and there are people in good faith who are doing this in the world. There's again, this one guy that I follow, it calls it an ecology of practices, and it is a series of practices. So it could be faith practices. It is be communing with a culture that, again, in good faith, so to speak, are looking for the true, the good, and the beautiful in life, and wanting the best for the community, again, without judgment or without ensconcing themselves so much that then they start to see othering, the other communities and saying, oh, well, we're enlightening ourselves, and, we're surrounded by less enlightened. Again, it's a big ask, but to start in that direction where communitas or community forming, even if it's just a couple of people, and you
Mhm.
go out and you do things that make you feel good so there's like hedonic feeling good, like you go have a drink, or you go dancing, or you go do a really stimulating thing, like go to a neat vacation or whatever. Yeah, that's kind of like a hedonic goodness. But this is more eudaimonic, which is a fancy Greek word for saying a well-being state, a state that might invoke happiness, but at the same time, it just invokes a satisfaction that you're doing well for others and for
Yeah.
yourself, and it's a feedback. So I'll stop preaching so much there, but it's just like that to me is where I'm sort of coming to this conclusion that we are certainly a social species. We are social creatures. And when we do social right, that we can build ourselves up and we can support the others in the community. And the reason I keep saying like small communities is I follow a complexity systems scientist who talks about, in scaling operations like this, that it breaks down at a certain level, that you can only scale this kind of cooperative communitas to a certain degree, and then it runs into trouble. Then you
Yeah.
get in siloing, tribalism, things like that. You get into othering and things like that. And so what you can do is safeguard against that by keeping the community small. But in doing that you recognize that that just look for the likeness in the others, and don't worry about, if other people aren't whatever turning on, or getting eudaimonic. It's okay. So it's just a delicate balance. But that's kind of one of the conclusions I'm starting to draw, is that if we are to work ourselves out of a meta crisis, a meaning crisis, a crisis of faith, a loneliness epidemic, suicide ideation, and high rates of suicide among young
Mm.
people, is to build these loving, trusting, nesting communities of empathy, support, compassion,
Absolutely.
true good, beautiful. I'm really nailing a lot of things, but I know we don't have a lot of time. So yeah, that's the wish I would have for my fellow humans, is that we find this niche for ourselves, and that when we find the niche, that we work very, very hard, because you know what? We all have a shadow side. We all have that
Mhm.
Jungian shadow that has to be acknowledged. And that's another critique of modern Western culture, is it's called the cult of innocence. It's like we always strive for being that light person and the happy person or the together person.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we have to be allowed to fall apart. We have to be allowed to be
Yeah.
foolish or self-destructive to a minor, not acting on it, but just let those feelings come up. I do it all the time. I do shadow work, probably not the best way, but I listen to really aggressive death metal, and I'll watch some things on sometimes on YouTube that are not healthy, like, police chases or things like that, just to, check in with that
Yeah,
kind
we
of
can't be happy
sociopathic.
all the time.
Right, right. Yes.
We have diverse feelings and
Yeah,
moods because we do, and we have to express them and experience them all. But
yeah.
we don't have to live there in the dark ones.
No, 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 no. It's oscillation, right? It's
Yeah.
it's this ability to move and
The
find yourself.
balance of light and dark and all that good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And again, if we can, with the support of a community, or even just
Mhm.
a family, I mean, whoever it is you love and trust, and you can be yourself around. And that could be a challenge. I could be saying that to people in the audience who are like, I don't have anybody I love and trust. Well, yeah,
There are
that's true.
sadly a lot of people who
Yeah.
don't have anyone. They feel like they are completely alone in the world.
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't have any friends per se. I have my wife of 20, we've been together 27 years. I have a couple of friends that I connect with occasionally, but I don't have a huge social cache.
Yeah.
But I'm weird. I like being like you and I talking. It's like I think they call it ambivert. I'm not an extrovert
Mhm.
necessarily, and I'm not an introvert, but
Yeah.
I can oscillate. And
Yeah.
and I love being in group situations sometimes, and I love being alone. So we have to find our place on that spectrum. But like I said, I don't have a huge cache of friends, and I'm good with that. I don't feel lonely, and I don't feel deprived. I do have a wonderful
As
partner, so that
long as you
helps.
have what you need.
Yeah, exactly.
If you need to be around people, then you need to have people to be around who
Exactly.
will love and support and encourage you, um, and, do things together that make you feel good.
Yes.
And if you
Yes.
don't need lots of people, but everybody needs at least a couple. We cannot, as human beings, go through life absolutely alone.
No.
We're not meant to do that.
No, no, and not to judge people who live as hermits and recluse, but I would suggest that they're outliers, and that
Yeah.
the fat part of the bell
Yes.
curve, which in most of us fall, is we and I would say, if you are out there and you're struggling with loneliness, because like I said, when I was 15 to 23, I was just it was killing me. I was surrounded by people, but I was alone. I just felt
Mhm.
completely isolated, and I know the feeling, and that's what drove me into a really deep, dark depression. I still it's still there. I mean, I'm not depressed, but the shadowy aspects of it are still there, and that's part of what drives me to want to have these kind of conversations, that if one person can shift their trajectory a little bit by what you and I did, that's great. That's all I would ever ask of the world, and my fellow humans, is just to, here, I'm handing something off to you, take it and run
Yeah.
with it, and know it's okay. If you're alone and you're struggling, it's okay, in the sense that it's not abnormal. You're not a freak. I would say the majority of us do that. And whatever you see on Instagram or whatever you see on Facebook, it's bullshit. It's most likely performative.
Yeah.
And I could get into a whole nother can of worms about social media, but I'll spare you that, because I respect our time. But yeah, it's just know that, as you said, Janet, that you have to do you. You have to be your authentic self, and it may be a meta practice to have somebody work with you to discover, what is an authentic self, and how do I authentically express myself? Because again, we can get lost
Oh,
existentially
yes.
nihilistic, and in the vacuum of the fakeness of social media, the prolificity of ourselves as not being really who we are when we're on
Yeah.
that.
Or, people pleasing, trying to make
Yes.
everybody else happy and losing ourselves in the process. And
Yeah.
that can also lead to depression and anxiety and all the things. Life doesn't seem like living because we're not living. We're
Mm-mm.
living what other people think we should be living, the way that they think we should be doing it. And that is not a prescription for happiness either.
No, no, I 100% agree. I 100% agree. And I've been guilty of people pleasing. My wife confesses to it a lot. She's like, "Oh, pleaser," and I'm like, "It's okay. You acknowledged it at least, and that's
Yeah.
good to know that." And then, so, we can be the opposite of selfish sometimes, like and give ourselves away, and that could build these sort of underlying undercurrents of resentment. And that
Mhm.
resentment could then get reprojected back onto yourself, or you project it out onto other people. So we're complex. Yeah.
We are so complex.
Yeah.
Yes.
But on the flip side, when you invert the pathologies that can arise rather from our complexities, that the creative potential, when we are congruent or in coherence with, again, get Jungian, the light side, the more
Mhm.
angelic side of our nature, that it's a turnaround that will you know really move you into a space where life is livable, life is
Yes.
enjoyable. It's you savor the moments. I think one pragmatic takeaway for two sort of bouts with the cold hand of death is just that I don't mind dying. I do not fear it. I have no apprehension at all, but I
Mhm.
have a healthy respect and a desire to continue to keep living because I found purpose, meaning, and sense making for myself. And it's not perfect and it's not great, but it's developing continuously. It's always going to be growing. I'm going to be chucking old things out and onboarding new things. That's that predictive processing, right? You're just
Yeah.
bringing new things in. And that to me is where the jazz is that you know that you can change, you can morph,
Mhm.
and be humble about it and just like you said earlier, be in the flow state with that. And I think that's what makes life livable. That's what helps get you up in the morning to see what the next page, the next paragraph is going to bring in your book. And it's not so much about chasing happiness; it's more about chasing curiosity or
Yes.
chasing the inquiry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Justin. I have loved this conversation.
I'm glad you did because I can ramble as you know, as you now know. Yeah, so
Yes,
I'm glad it was
yes,
okay
and
for you.
that's okay. My son has ADHD, so I'm well aware
But then you're used to
of
it.
info dumping.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I have to there's so many things that can be,
There's so
yeah,
many
yeah.
things.
But I try to restrain myself. But thank you for indulging my my
Of
tangents and my
course, it was
mania.
fascinating and really a really interesting and unique perspective on life and existence and being. So, yeah, thank you again for being here and sharing your story. I
Yeah.
appreciate you.
Well, and I appreciate you, Janet, because you're doing good work. And when this comes out, I'm going to make sure I get it out on my socials and that we help platform you and bullhorn out the Phoenix narrative because I'm a Phoenix story. I've come back a couple of times, and
We all are.
yeah,
Everybody on this show is a phoenix.
yeah, yeah. And I appreciate you giving this space for not only myself, but any of the guests that you had. You're doing an amazing thing. And I want to acknowledge you and offer my gratitude for doing that because these voices need to be heard because they are going to go into the ears of people who can then be boosted by that. So you're doing
Exactly.
wonderful things, Janet.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you, audience, for indulging my tangents as well. I hope there was something out there for you in what I said.
I'm sure there is. If I got something out of it, somebody else will too.
There you go. There you go. May it be so.
So say we all.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
Thank you for listening. Remember that you are loved, you are worthy, you are valuable, you are meant for more, and that it really does get better. If you are in crisis, there are numbers that you can call or text to get the help that you need. That information for Canada and the US is in the description below each episode. If you are in immediate crisis, please call 911. We love you, and I hope you'll listen again.